Alrighty, well, welcome everyone. We're very happy to join you to this session for the CSA's Agentic AI Summit. My name is Dan Stocker. I'm one of the co-chairs for the CSA AI initiative, and I'm joined today by my fellow JPMorgan Chase colleague, Sean Gray. Sean, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Gray, Managing Director and Global Head of Cybersecurity for Payments at JPMorgan Chase.
Well, we are here to talk to you all about evolving controls for Agentic AI. As with all advents of new technology, right, organizations want to manage that change and make sure that their strategy and execution remains sound. So in our perspective, we see this as an evolution of existing controls rather than a revolution. And put in a normal sense, management of controls comes down to roughly three things: people, processes, and technology. Now, AI agents are really a blend of all three in the sense that they are technology and they are used for processes. Let's call it automation, for example. And, well, they're not people, but one of the things that makes them exceptionally interesting and useful is that they approximate human judgment. And I mean that across the board, from the good to the bad. So we can just park that for the moment. And so this makes them different than the other three. You have tools available in your control set for each of those dimensions, but agents, when they combine them, actually kind of stretch those definitions a lot. So we see this as a challenge for organizations to evolve how they manage risk with controls. And this is going to have an impact across the entire range of controls. And let's start, for example, Sean, with just asset management, knowing what you got and where it is.
And assets, when you think about assets can take lots of different forms, right? The agent itself can be an asset, but also when you think about data assets, technological assets in terms of infrastructure, whether it's physical or logical, networking assets. And it's interesting when you start to think about, while the agents themselves should and could be perceived as assets, it's the connectiveness. They need to connect to and establish a mesh into other types of assets that have different types of risk and security implications and control landscape around them. So it's not just the fact of the asset that you're dealing with directly, but it's also the assets that then needs to connect out to interact with, pull data from, extrapolate off of the data points from, and then the pathways that it takes to get to those data nodes, all sort of build this really complex ecosystem of controls that you need to kind of really think through very intentionally.
One of the central aspects of that, of course, is entitlements, right? What does an AI agent have the entitlement to do with your data, right? With the connectivity to some resource or a third party. And that comes down to a question of identity and access management. It is one of the oldest fields in security, identity. And I'm always really impressed with the fact that it's also one of the areas which is under the most active change and innovation and change. So for agents, that's what our 2025 is about. Who are your agents? What are they doing? And are they allowed to? Existing primitives for dealing with identity are not entirely always suited for tracking agent identities. This comes down to a combination of the fact that agents that can do things may or may not be working on behalf of a user. So the on behalf of concept is an important one to be able to think about in this area. They may be doing so for their own sake, which in search and pursuit of goals that they've been assigned. So just that distinction right there in one hop from user to agent makes a difference. And there's more besides that. It's a very rich area to plumb for what the surface area is for your particular organization and the way that you've implemented IAM. So I encourage you to look at that and do so with an open mind, because I think you find all kind of nooks and crannies that are not exactly settled from an industry perspective. And all this is going on, right? And we want to be able to keep track of it and react to it, and for things that are exceptional, right, Sean? And so observability is a question too.
Absolutely. I think, to your point around identity, it is one of the oldest areas of cybersecurity because it's primary. It's fundamental to how systems, agents, workloads, people interact in a complex ecosystem. And so that, exactly to your point, that confirmation of and explicit definition of identity and what is and is not allowed from an entitlement standpoint is just a fundamental building block. And when we talk about observability, obviously, in my mind, there's sort of two pieces, right? There's observing what is being injected into your agents, what types of prompts, what is the data that is being instantiated into your data stores by just through the native use of tools like agents. But the other is also the output, tracking the fidelity, efficacy, and accuracy of the data coming out, how usable it is. All these things go into sort of the observability. So it's not just the natural thing in when you're managing infrastructure is thinking about the telemetry coming out of that to measure performance and uptime and resiliency. But this is really a two-way street. You care about both avenues of observability, what's going in, but also what's obviously coming out.
It's true. And we care about that partly because there's impact to it, right? So from a security perspective, there are a variety of things that are known to be issues for AI systems broadly, right? Using the NIST AI risk management framework term there. AI system is a software system, an application, if you will, that has one of its components, an AI model, which, let's not quibble about that today, right? Call it generative AI, a large language model maybe. So what can go wrong there? You've already noted a few things there. You care about what goes into the model, and that's because there's a thing called prompt injection, where you can just tell the model to do something that it's not supposed to do. And some of this is an inherent problem in generative AI, in particular large language models, because the control and data bands are munged together. Right, they're not separate. So that's not something that you can just fix. It's something that you have to band-aid around, tie a lot, so to speak, in sailor terms, and do your best to monitor, to have observability, to note when things have gone wrong. That's really important. There's a variety of good thinkers in this space, for example, who can give you some good rubrics about how to think about when your system might be set up for some failures there. And I want to give a brief shout out to Simon Willison and his lethal trifecta. Right, he has a good talk about that on YouTube. Output is also a problem because for all the good reasons of you don't want your application to be saying rude things to people, but also for the fact that you don't want it to disclose things it shouldn't. And this is a fundamental challenge in the sense that from a traditional control perspective, right, before AI was a thing, you could determine whether someone could access a piece of data based on their entitlements to it at a database. And now all that goes away because those control regimes disappear when they enter the large language model. It's a problem. So all these things are fundamental challenges, and now we add to that the concept of agency. One of these large language models that has all of these fundamental challenges is also supposed to go out and mutate the world on your behalf. Just going to pause to let that sink in for a minute. And after you've enabled it to do that, you're also going to give it some measure of autonomy to decide how to. And there's an old description of a large language model as an exceptionally smart intern that lacks any experience or common sense. And so, just that that description alone ought to give people some pause. So it's worth taking a few moments to ensure that you have a handle on what it is you're doing and Moving from there, for example, um, we note that the industry, we're all in this together in a sense, right? So Sean, I know that you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, for sure. It is the nature of any new emerging technology is that it's innovative, it's new. We're still figuring out how best to manage, how best to secure, how best to implement, how best to use a new set of tools. I think worth doing a quick shout out to the Cloud Security Alliance, I think, which is doing a great job of leading from the forefront, bringing the right industry leaders, the right thought leaders together to sort of tackle this problem as a group, rather than each of us trying to solve it all by our lonesome, which is less effective. I think one of the things you mentioned a second ago, Dan, around agency and autonomy is just you articulate it really well on why guardrails are so very critical, why understanding the level of the controls that you put into place up and down the entire stack. So you're not just managing what data can and can't be interacted with and under what circumstances, but also what the agents can then go out and do based on that information, what you're asking it to do via prompt or otherwise. So the guardrails, from the get-go, from like secure from the start, has to be in place.
So the question of how we do that, right, in terms of tooling, et cetera. So there's, depending on the size of the organization, there's going to be an existing set of tooling, right? Larger organizations will have a larger ecosystem, right? Because they will generally, by virtue of being larger, have had more time to understand their own problems and develop, internal point solutions for certain things. But there is a very large incoming tide of startups, some more than just startups, offering solutions for various kinds of levels of integration and expansive claims about helping you manage AI security. What do you think the relevant dimensions are there, Sean, for how organizations can help decide about what set to work with?
I think, at the outset, like taking a step back, I think it's really just another example of the classic build versus buy decision tree, right? The benefits to building yourself are the obvious ones. You know your ecosystem better than any outside vendor is going to. You know your data pipelines, you know the outcomes you're trying to drive towards. And I think most importantly, when you look at what is the problem that you're trying to build a solution for using this new technology, and if you start with the problem statement and working backwards, often it's the build, the roll your own types of solutions that emerge as a natural fit. That said, there's a lot of benefit to just buying something off the shelf and then customizing it. Less heavy and onerous requirements around spend for headcount, administration, management, all the things that go into this. Maintaining a developer team that can, dedicate towards building this sort of thing. And if your use case is not sufficiently strategic and critical for the business, then it becomes a very interesting question. And sometimes the buy model becomes a lot more palatable and just a lot more logical. So again, I think it's just a natural extension of that same conversation that's happened in technology for decades and decades, of whether it makes more sense to build your own or to buy something off the shelf and customize it to your use case.
One way for an organization to get a sense for where its gaps are, right, is to do some combination of analysis, tabletop exercises, et cetera, which work backwards from an incident to where the controls might have been in the first place to have avoided it. That's a fairly straightforward way of getting a handle on where the major gaps are. There's always going to be nuance, and particularly in this area, there will be nuance that will escape that analysis, but you'll be better positioned to start with, at least. And that's a way of identifying both control gaps and potentially, as you point out, also where the native ecosystem for applications and other types of solutions are lacking. So, how should an organization go about deciding some of this and making some of these very large and impactful decisions? We recommend, for example, that an organization have a fairly clear understanding of responsibility and accountability. So the allure of building AI systems and AI agents is well known at this point. And the grounding in the risks attendant to those things is perhaps trailing just slightly of that. And That's okay, because risk appetite can drive behaviors that, under other circumstances in more mature fields, would be reckless. But in this case, not necessarily. So the point here is less that security has to say, you can't fix all these things, and therefore you shouldn't do it. That's not going to work, right? Neither is it the case that because something can be done, that it should be. That is equally reckless on the other side of the spectrum. So the way to get through that, to navigate that dichotomy, right, is to work together, and hopefully to inculcate an organizational structure that helps balance innovation that's possible from AI agents and risk management from those, which keeps the organization afloat, right, and is in line with the established risk appetite of the organization. And there are some organizations where that may be itself a major challenge, a soft challenge versus a hard challenge, if you will, but a non-trivial one. And really, ultimately, some of this is going to come down to culture. And I think security folks, speaking as one who's been in that space for a while, often get a knock for not being able to lead in that sort of culture change conversation. And sometimes it's because they're tired of constantly pointing out, "Don't run with scissors," right? As you might expect. But I think there's a real opportunity here for security people to security as a field to help lead some of that conversation, and to have this be perhaps an opportunity for a bit of a sea change in the way that security enables the business, as opposed to acts as any sort of barrier to it.
From a business standpoint, being able to clearly define and articulate what your problem statement is, and then further from that, being able to articulate, is this problem statement sufficiently strategic and sufficiently transformative for my business that it's worth the investment of going down this path? And if you really introduce a lot of rigor into the conversation by asking those hard questions, you'll likely prune down the prospective use cases from, I don't know, hundreds or dozens down to a small handful. And that's probably the right answer. But to your point, security teams need to be looking at this as enablers, need to be thinking about, well, these things are out there, these things are growing, these things are being implemented. And so the best thing that we can do as security professionals is plug in as early as possible, understand the problem statement, and then help guide the business to get to the solution in as safe and secure a manner as it possibly can, maintaining integrity of your control stack end to end. If you have line of sight on that original problem statement, it's not out of the realm of probability that you're going to land in the right place, as long as you're engaged and supportive and enabling.
And clear-eyed, right? I like to say that Agentic AI is the balloon payment for tech debt, and in the sense that everything that could go wrong at that point is going to cost you more, right? It might not have been painful in the past, but it could very well be in the near future. So, being clear-eyed and acting with enlightened self-interest is almost always a good strategy, it seems to me, and that goes down to not just to the internal motivation, right, but also potentially extrinsic as well. We know that the U.S. government, for example, recently has taken a backseat for direct AI regulation and has ceded a lot of that space to the states. And some states are taking advantage of that. The EU has also advertised increased appetite for regulatory action. So these aren't purely about your own considerations. There are some extrinsic ones as well.
I think it's also worth keeping in the back of your minds when you talk about regulatory oversight and how much engagement, how much care they're going to bring to the table. Part of it is the nature of the use case themselves. What are you using it for? Under what circumstances? What is the outcome that you're expecting from it? But the other is, often regulators look at assets and access to assets as something that they care about. And so when you think about, like we talked about earlier, that intricate web of assets, whether they're data, network, logical, physical, agentic in nature, that interplay becomes also something that you want to keep in the back of your mind.
Yep. And just fundamentally, if we can't work together on this, how we expect our agents to do that. So we need to be good role models. How about that? So this is all nice, but we have some more concrete things to share as well. One of them, for example, is a rough categorization of the classes, if you will, of AI agents in terms of their complexity. And this may be useful for organizations that are looking to build. We know, for example, that chatbot agents, agents that have an LLM in them, right? You can talk to them, they can provide answers to you. Those have been in the field for years, right? There is a new wave coming where those AI systems, those agents, will be able to take actions on your behalf, right? This is the advent of agency that I mentioned earlier. And that's a whole new level of complexity, right? That part of that's being driven, most of you will have heard already of model context protocol, right? Anthropic's contribution to a basic interoperability layer, right, between agents and resources and tools and such. This is very much on the upswing, right? There's lots of those that you can take advantage of now. More are being built, but this is still early for that. There is a third category where the level of autonomy given to the agent for problem solving can result in a very broad and somewhat unbound level of agent spin up, resource access and gathering, and potentially multiple rounds of planning and execution. And if you think about those three, a very simple example that you're used to using already, one that you've read about and perhaps used as well. There's none in the third category out there just yet, right? But that most complicated class has all of the elements that will test all of your controls, as we mentioned earlier, in the sense that the execution patterns are not profilable in advance, right? They are up to a non-deterministic planning process that is yet to be spun up.
Sorry, Dan, I just want to interject 1 second. I want to double click on a word. It was just a small word, the word all. When we think about controls, capabilities, all of the controls in these scenarios come into play. All of them do. It's similar, or at least analogous, to when public cloud became a thing and everyone was migrating out of traditional data centers into public cloud, cloud service provider hosted environments. And there was various levels of dialogue around, well, this is riskier or less risk, and it's not. They're equivalent. They might be slightly different, but they're equivalent in nature. And so when you think about agentic AI implementations, whether using MCP, LLMs, other, like, all of the controls in your stack are relevant in these use cases and deployment models.
That's exactly right. And so one of the ways that organizations can, one approach they can take, right, to managing some of this complexity is that where expected execution patterns can be profiled in advance. Let's think about the middle category, right? One layer of tool usage. That baselining and then measuring for drift from a baseline that's been established empirically is one way that an organization can get a heads up on where things might have gone wrong. And that's tractable for that layer of complexity. Where the frontier is there, of course, is that the next layer up, where the execution patterns are not predefined. Baselining is even more challenging, but it's still basically the only tool you have to be able to understand if your system is operating within an acceptable range for any kind of characteristics, whether it's just pure operational or security. So keep in mind that the complexity of the system makes a difference for how much and in what ways it tests your controls. And don't forget about really basic ideas of, well, I don't know what the system's exactly supposed to do, but let's run it about 1,000 times, right? And see what it looks like. And maybe that gives us a decent baseline. And that kind of control then could be one that you consider, for example, for a pre-prod testing and fit for deployment like phase of your SDLC or CI/CD.
I think, as your point, Dan, also as agentic models become more complex, become more common, more of a standard in terms of human interaction with technical systems, as a security professional, your threat landscape just increased. You need to keep that in your mind, that this is a whole new threat vector, and these models, as they get deployed more and more, and as they become more and more complex, they become richer targets for bad actors. And so keeping in mind that just the threat landscape expansion component is non-trivial in a lot of these and will become even more trivial as it progresses.
Yep, and this is a great moment for us to give a second shout out to the CSA and the Maestro threat modeling framework for AI and AI agents, which is a very useful tool for organizations to get a handle on exactly what can go wrong. Right, organizations that have a robust or an established threat modeling practice, right, it should be an easy plug-in for that. And those that don't, Maestro is a great place to start, right? Particularly if agents are what you're doing here in 2025. Keep your ear peeled and think about having a spidey sense for three main considerations here. One, do you have sensitive data at play somewhere in your agentic system? Right, that should raise a bell. It should require extra attention. Two, do you have external access or external user bases, right, who are interacting with your agent? Also, something that deserves extra attention. Any unvetted data that can enter your LLM, right, as we've said now twice already, and it's worth repeating many more times, should raise maybe 2 or 3 bells, right, just by itself. And lastly, something we don't have a clever answer for because the entire world is trying to work on it, is the notion of all of these things we've just talked about, but in a third-party sense. And that requires an entire separate talk itself, right? I know that we can't even really dip much into that, other than if you're aware of it, then you're in the right place and space to be able to dig into it for your own purposes. Don't sleep on it. So, any last words of wisdom, Sean?
Sure, absolutely. I think the thing about any new technology, it's exciting, it's fun, it's a cool new toy, right? It's shiny in every way, and potentially for businesses, it's absolutely a superpower. It's a weapon that you can use for good. And you need to find the right balance because you are operating on the bleeding edge of technology and innovation. You need to find the right balance of innovation versus security, making sure you get the right guardrails in place while also enabling the business to move with the velocity in implementation and deployment that you need to. So as long as I know we've used the word culture a bunch in the past few minutes, but that culture of balancing innovation and security is absolutely critical to success in this type of a thing.
I could not agree more. And with that, I think this is a good first cut, right? We should come back and talk more about third parties. What do you say?
Agreed.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we hope you have a great rest of the conference, and we look forward to seeing you out there.